There was a person who never lost a single debate, not because they were always right, not because they were louder, faster, or more aggressive than everyone else, but because they never entered a debate to win in the first place. While others burned their mental energy defending positions and attacking opponents, this person did something that seemed almost too simple to be powerful. They asked questions. Each question was precise. Each one cut through layers of assumption and emotion until the argument collapsed. Not from the outside, but from within. The person holding the position would feel it happening in real time. The ground beneath their certainty would begin to shift, and often they would walk away in silence, not defeated, but genuinely thinking for the first time in years. That person was Socrates. And the method he developed 2,000 years ago is still the most sophisticated tool for clear thinking, honest dialogue, and intellectual mastery that has ever existed. Today, you are going to learn 5 questions that form the core of the Socratic method, reframed through the lens of Stoic philosophy, because these questions are not just debate tactics. In the Stoic tradition, they are instruments of self-examination, tools for separating what is true from what merely feels true, and one of the most powerful practices available to anyone who genuinely seeks wisdom over applause. Stay until the end, because the final section on defense, ethics, and how to use this against yourself is the part most people never hear, and it may be the most important of all. If this kind of content is what you've been looking for, leave a like right now. That one gesture tells the algorithm that this type of depth deserves to reach more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that before you continue. New content every week, built for people who want more than surface-level answers. Before we go into the 5 questions themselves, we need to understand something fundamental about why questions defeat arguments, and why this has been true across every culture, every era, and every context in which clear thinking has mattered. When someone makes an argument, they expose themselves. They construct a structure out of words, assumptions, and conclusions. And every structure, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside, rests on a foundation. The person who argues tries to build that structure higher and higher. The person who questions does something entirely different. They dig. They go down to the base, to the hidden layer beneath the polished surface, to the assumptions that were never examined, the beliefs that were inherited rather than chosen, the emotional logic dressed up to look like rational thought. And when the foundation shifts, when just one load-bearing assumption is exposed to honest scrutiny, the entire structure above it trembles. Here is the psychological edge that the Stoics understood long before modern cognitive science confirmed it. Arguments make people defensive. Questions make people think. The ego's deepest need is to be right. The moment you attack a belief directly, you trigger that defensive response, and the person doubles down. They stop listening and start protecting. But a genuine question? A genuine question bypasses the defense entirely. It invites the person to draw the map of their own beliefs. And when they reach the edge of that map, they discover the ground beneath them was never solid to begin with. Marcus Aurelius called this the practice of diacrisis, the disciplined separation of what appears to be true from what actually is. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around it, and Socrates, who understood human psychology with a precision that still astonishes, made it the foundation of every conversation he ever had. This is not manipulation. This is clarity. There is a difference, and we will return to it. The first question. How do you know that's true? It sounds almost too simple, almost harmless. 4 words that seem completely non-threatening in the opening of any conversation. That is exactly what makes it so powerful. Every person you will ever meet carries a set of beliefs about the world, beliefs about success, relationships, politics, identity. what is possible and what is not. Most of those beliefs feel completely solid, like facts rather than opinions, like the natural order of things rather than ideas that were absorbed unconsciously from the surrounding environment. But when you ask someone how they actually know a belief is true, something happens. They reach for the source. And in almost every case, what they find is not evidence. What they find is repetition. I heard it somewhere. Everyone knows that. It's just obvious. My parents told me. It was on the news. These are not sources of knowledge. They are records of exposure. And there is an enormous difference between the two. The Stoic tradition was built on this distinction. Epictetus taught that the unexamined life is not just philosophically incomplete, it is dangerous. Because what you have never questioned, you cannot choose. And what you cannot choose, you cannot change. You are simply living inside a set of inherited conclusions, and you will defend them with the ferocity of personal identity, even when they no longer serve you. This is what the question, how do you know that's true, actually does when it lands correctly. It does not attack the belief. It asks the person to trace the belief back to its origin. And in that tracing, most people discover that what they called truth was something they had never genuinely examined. Think about how many widespread beliefs exist that most people have never interrogated. The belief that success requires a specific path. The belief that certain emotions are unacceptable. The belief that changing your mind is a sign of weakness. The belief that struggle is evidence of failure. Every one of these beliefs shapes decisions, limits possibilities, and generates suffering. And almost none of them were consciously chosen. The Stoics had a practice called catalepsis, the genuine grasping of truth. Not the comfortable acceptance of inherited ideas, but the active pursuit of what can actually be verified. How do you know that's true? Is the entry point to that practice. And here is the advanced variation that takes this even further. What would have to be true for that to be false? This single follow-up question does something remarkable. It forces the person to look at their belief from the outside, to imagine a world in which their certainty is wrong and ask what that world would look like. Most people have never done this with their most closely held convictions. The exercise alone can produce more clarity in 5 minutes than years of debate ever would. Use it with patience. Use it without judgment. And then be silent. Because the silence that follows is not emptiness. It is the sound of genuine thinking beginning. The second question, what are you assuming? Every argument is an iceberg. What you see on the surface, the stated position, the visible logic, the explicit claim, is only the smallest portion of what is actually there. The bulk of any argument lives underwater, invisible, unexamined, and almost never questioned, because it is so deeply embedded that it no longer feels like an assumption. It feels like reality itself. Here is a common example. Someone says, education is the most important factor in a person's success. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. It even sounds admirable. But beneath that statement, a series of assumptions are doing all the structural work. The assumption that success means the same thing to everyone. The assumption that formal credentials reliably produce the outcomes people seek. The assumption that the path others have taken is the right path for all contexts and all individuals. The assumption that what worked in one generation or one culture transfers cleanly to another. Peel away those assumptions, gently, without attack, simply by naming them, and the original statement begins to tremble. Not because it is wrong, necessarily, but because it is far less certain than it appeared to be. This is what are you assuming? Actually does. It does not destroy the argument through confrontation. It exposes it through awareness. It shines light on the part of the structure that was doing all the work while remaining completely invisible. The Stoics called assumptions prolepsis when they were clear and genuine, and fantasia when they were distorted impressions masquerading as truth. The entire Stoic training in perception was built around the capacity to distinguish between the two, to stop, to examine, and to ask, is this impression accurate, or is it a story I built without noticing? Seneca captured this in one of his most memorable observations. Most human suffering does not come from actual circumstances. It comes from the stories people construct around those circumstances, the unexamined assumptions that transform a neutral event into evidence of catastrophe. When someone says, "I am not capable of doing this," they are making an assumption. They are assuming that their current level of competence is fixed, that past performance reliably predicts future potential, that the standard they are measuring themselves against is the right one for their situation. Ask, what are you assuming? And you do not attack the self-doubt. You simply expose the invisible architecture beneath it. That is the power of this question. It does not argue. It illuminates. And in that illumination, the person often finds that what felt like certainty was always just a story, one that can be rewritten once it is seen clearly. The third question, what evidence would change your mind? This is the line that separates the genuine thinker from the person who has stopped thinking. A rational mind, a mind committed to truth rather than comfort, can always answer this question. It can describe the kind of evidence, the type of observation, the quality of argument that would cause it to revise its position. The willingness to change in the presence of better information is not weakness. In the Stoic tradition, it is one of the defining characteristics of wisdom. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this directly in his private reflections. He returned repeatedly to the importance of being willing to be corrected, not just by others, but by reality itself. He trained himself to welcome the moment when evidence contradicted his expectations, because that moment was, in his view, one of the highest gifts available to a thinking mind. It meant reality was still teaching him. The opposite, the mind that cannot name any evidence that would change its view, has, in a very specific sense, stopped learning. It has replaced inquiry with ideology. It has turned a belief into an identity. And when a belief becomes an identity, defending it no longer feels like stubbornness. It feels like survival. This is why the question, what evidence would change your mind, is so revealing. It does not ask whether the person is right or wrong. It asks whether they are still operating in the mode of inquiry, or whether they have crossed over into the mode of defending territory. If someone answers, "Nothing could change my mind on this," and means it, they have already told you everything you need to know. Not that they are a bad person, not that their position is necessarily incorrect, but that reason has reached its limit in this conversation. They are no longer engaged in thinking. They are engaged in protection. Epictetus was precise about this. He observed that no one can learn what they already believe they know. The closed mind is not protected from error by its certainty. It is made permanently vulnerable to the errors it cannot see because it has decided to stop looking. In everyday life, this question can be used with remarkable gentleness. When someone is expressing a fixed opinion, you do not need to challenge it directly. Simply ask, if new information appeared that pointed in a different direction, would you be open to looking at it? If they say yes, you have opened a door. If they hesitate, you have identified where the conversation's real limit is, not in the evidence, but in the relationship between that person and their own certainty. And here is the Stoic reflection that this question ultimately produces. How often do we ask it of ourselves? How often do we sit with our most cherished beliefs and ask, with genuine openness, what would it take for me to discover I was wrong about this? That practice, applied consistently, is one of the most transformative intellectual disciplines available to any person who wants to think clearly. The fourth question: what would someone who disagrees with you say? Most people, if they are honest, cannot answer this question well. They can describe what they imagine someone who disagrees with them would say, but that description is usually a caricature, a simplification, a version of the opposing view that is easier to dismiss than the actual position held by thoughtful people who disagree. This is not a moral failure, it is a structural one. Human beings naturally spend far more time inside their own perspective than outside it. We rehearse our own arguments. We remember the evidence that supports what we believe. We surround ourselves with people who share our general worldview. And over time, our mental model of opposing views becomes less accurate, not more, because it is built from imagination rather than genuine engagement. The Stoic tradition had a specific practice for this. It was called antistrophos, the turning of the argument around, the deliberate effort to present the opposing view as fully and as charitably as possible before attempting to respond to it. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to understand his opponents better than they understood themselves, not as a debating tactic, as an intellectual discipline, because he knew that a position you cannot accurately describe is a position you do not truly understand. The question, "What would someone who disagrees with you say?" is at its core a test of comprehension. It asks, have you actually listened? Have you genuinely engaged with the strongest version of the opposing view, not the weakest version, not the straw man, not the easy target, but the version held by the most thoughtful people who have thought about this most carefully? If the answer is no, if the person can only describe a crude or dismissive version of the opposing view, then they do not actually understand the issue as well as they believe they do. And asking them this question gently, without accusation, is one of the most respectful things you can do, because it invites them toward greater understanding rather than simply exposing the gap. This question also has a deeply practical application in personal relationships. When a conflict arises between two people, the first instinct on both sides is to rehearse their own grievance, to organize the evidence for why they are right, to build the case. But the conversation that actually resolves conflict is the one where both people can look at the situation from the other side's perspective, not to surrender their own view, but to genuinely grasp what the other person is experiencing. If you were in my position, what would this feel like? That single question, which is a variation of the fourth Socratic question applied to emotional reality rather than abstract argument, has ended more conflicts than any logical demonstration ever has, because it reaches past the argument to the person behind it. The fifth question: what would happen if everyone thought the way you do? This is the question that brings everything down to earth. Abstract beliefs are comfortable. They exist in a space where consequences are theoretical, where the edges of the logic never quite meet reality, where the beauty of an idea can be appreciated without the messiness of full application. The fifth Socratic question removes that comfort. It takes the idea out of the clouds and places it into the world. What would happen if everyone actually lived according to this principle? Socrates called this method reductio ad absurdum, taking an idea to its logical conclusion to discover whether it holds together under real conditions. The Stoics extended this into what Marcus Aurelius described as the universal test. What is genuinely right must be right for everyone, not just for me in this situation on this particular day. A principle that benefits you in the moment but collapses when applied universally is not a principle at all. It is a rationalization. And the fifth question is the most reliable way to discover the difference. Here is how it works in practice. Someone says, it is acceptable to bend the truth a little in a competitive environment. Apply the fifth question. What would the environment look like if everyone operated that way? What happens to trust, cooperation, and the shared foundation that makes competition possible at all? If everyone bends the truth a little, the comfortable rationalization that seemed harmless in isolation reveals its full consequences when applied at scale. Or consider something more personal. Someone says, "I do not owe anyone an explanation for my choices." There is real truth in that. Autonomy matters. Self-determination matters. But apply the fifth question. What kind of community, what kind of relationships are built when no one feels any accountability to anyone else? When explanation and transparency are treated as unnecessary, the question does not say the original position is wrong. It says, take it seriously enough to follow it all the way to the end. See what it actually produces when it meets reality at full scale. This is the Stoic practice of examining the telos, the purpose, the ultimate direction of any belief or behavior. Not just what it achieves in the immediate moment, but what it builds or destroys over time and at scale. When used with someone who is operating from genuine principle rather than ego, this question produces remarkable clarity. It forces the person to either defend their position at full logical extension, which strengthens it if it is genuinely sound, or to discover where the principle breaks down and needs refinement. Either way, truth advances. Advanced application. 4 tactical dimensions of Socratic thinking. These 5 questions are the foundation, but there are 4 additional practices that elevate their application from basic questioning to genuine Stoic intellectual mastery. The first is strategic silence. After you ask a question, stop talking. Completely. Most people are deeply uncomfortable with silence and will rush to fill it. And in that rush, in that unguarded moment when the considered answer has not yet arrived, they reveal what they didn't intend to reveal. The unpolished thought, the genuine uncertainty, the admission that lives beneath the rehearsed position. The Stoics prized silence not as passivity, but as a form of presence. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the discipline of speaking less and observing more as one of the consistent practices of his daily training. Silence after a question is not emptiness. It is pressure, gentle, patient, and far more revealing than any counter-argument. The second is the clarification loop. When someone gives a vague or broad answer, do not let it pass. Ask them to be more specific, then more specific still. Can you give me an example of that? What exactly do you mean by that term? What would that look like in practice? Most broad statements that sound impressive become much less certain when they have to meet a concrete example. This is not a trick. It is the Stoic practice of demanding clarity from language, which Epictetus considered one of the basic disciplines of honest thinking. The third is the consistency check. When someone says something that appears to contradict something they said earlier, you do not need to attack the contradiction. Simply name it. Earlier you said this, and now you are saying this. How do those fit together? This is not a trap. It is an invitation to coherence, and coherence is exactly what the Stoics demanded of their own thinking. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the importance of living consistently, of the danger of a life where words and actions point in different directions. The consistency check, applied in conversation, extends that discipline into dialogue. The fourth is the example trap, though it is perhaps better described as the concreteness test. Can you give me a specific, real example of that? Abstract claims are easy to make and almost impossible to disprove. Concrete examples are testable. They either hold up or they do not. Asking for a real example is one of the quickest ways to discover whether a sweeping statement has actual substance behind it, or whether it is an impressive-sounding generalization built on nothing. Defense. What to do when the questions are directed at you. Everything described in this video can be used on you. And when it is, when someone begins asking you genuinely good questions that expose the foundations of your own beliefs, the untrained response is to feel attacked, to feel that your intelligence or your integrity is being challenged, to become defensive. The Stoic response is different. A genuine question is not an attack, it is a gift. It is an opportunity to either strengthen a belief you hold for good reasons, by articulating those reasons clearly under scrutiny, or to discover that a belief you held comfortably was never as solid as you thought. Both of those outcomes are valuable. When someone is clearly applying Socratic questioning to your position, the most powerful response is to welcome it. That is a genuinely good question. Let me think about that carefully, or if you want to examine their reasoning at the same time. Before I answer, I am curious about your view. What is your own position on this? That response does not deflect. It balances. It moves the conversation from interrogation to dialogue, which is what Socrates himself always preferred. The goal was never to make one side win and one side lose. The goal was for both sides to arrive at greater clarity than either possessed before the conversation began. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this capacity, the ability to be corrected without humiliation, to receive a challenge to one's thinking as an opportunity rather than a threat, as one of the marks of a truly educated mind. Not education in the formal sense, education in the Stoic sense, the ongoing cultivation of the capacity to think clearly, to act rightly, and to hold beliefs that can survive honest examination. The ethics and responsibility of this power Socrates was condemned to death. Not for lying, not for wrongdoing in the conventional sense, but for asking too many questions that were true, for making the powerful feel the ground shift beneath their certainty, for refusing to stop his pursuit of genuine understanding, even when that pursuit became inconvenient for people with status to protect. That history carries a lesson that applies as much today as it did in ancient Athens. Questions are power, and every form of power creates a choice about how to use it. There are 3 intellectual virtues that must accompany this method if it is to be used with integrity. The first is genuine humility. The questions are not a performance of superiority. They are an acknowledgement that you do not have all the answers either, and that truth, if it exists to be found, will require honest inquiry from everyone involved, including yourself. The second is sincere curiosity. The questions must be asked to understand, not to perform understanding while secretly seeking to embarrass or dominate. The Stoics were exceptionally precise about this distinction. Epictetus warned against using the appearance of philosophical inquiry as a disguise for ego. The test is simple. Are you asking because you genuinely want to understand, or because you want to demonstrate that you are smarter than the person you are questioning? The third is commitment to dialogue rather than dominance. The Socratic method reaches its full potential when both people are genuinely searching, when the conversation moves toward shared clarity rather than individual victory. That requires the person asking the questions to remain open to being questioned in return. And there are contexts where Socratic questioning should be set aside entirely, not because the method is flawed, but because wisdom includes knowing when a different approach serves better. When someone is experiencing acute emotional pain, what they need is not logical inquiry. They need to feel heard when a decision needs to be made quickly and the analysis has already been done. Additional questioning creates paralysis rather than clarity. In some professional relationships, persistent questioning can be interpreted as disrespect rather than intellectual engagement. And in close personal relationships, the constant application of rigorous questioning can begin to feel less like genuine interest and more like judgment. which is the opposite of what most relationships need. A Stoic thinker does not just know how to ask well, they know when to ask and when to simply be present. Applying this to every dimension of your life. The 5 questions are not reserved for formal debates or philosophical conversations. They apply everywhere that clear thinking matters, which is to say, everywhere. In professional environments, the questions transform decision-making. Instead of directing someone to do something a particular way, asking, "What risks do you see if we tried the opposite approach?" does something far more valuable than compliance. It invites genuine engagement. It surfaces information that would never have emerged from a directive, and it creates ownership. People commit far more deeply to decisions they helped think through than to orders they simply received. The question, "How do you know that will work?" applied to your own team's assumptions before a major decision is one of the most powerful quality control tools available. Not as an expression of doubt, but as an expression of intellectual rigor. In education and parenting, the questions shift the entire dynamic from transmission to awakening. Instead of delivering information or issuing corrections, asking, "What do you think will happen if you approach it that way?" invites the person, regardless of age, to engage their own capacity for reasoning. That engagement is where genuine learning begins. That is not control. That is the cultivation of independent thinking, which is the only education that lasts. In personal